interwebs, I hope you're all doing well because I am here to surprisingly review the very first episode of the Halo adaptation over on Paramount Plus, this episode titled Contact. And I say that I'm kind of surprised to be reviewing this series because while I am a huge fan of Halo, I am a huge fan of Halo. I have played every single one of the games from start to completion. I played most of them on the day that they came out, and I will even say this, my favorite is ODST. I know that's a controversial choice, but I will stand by it. I mean, it has Nathan Fillion and Alan Tudyk. What more do you want from me? But also, I've read a lot of the books, and I've even listened to the audio drama, so while I'm not, the biggest Halo fan, I am a pretty big Halo fan. I mean, I even have the freaking Halo 3 Master Chief head on a stick here because I'm old and I've had it for over a decade. But regardless, while I am a big Halo fan, a lot of the reviews and sort of buzz about this Halo show going into it was kind of lukewarm at best. And I will say, as someone who is a big Halo fan, what I've loved about the Halo franchise is not really the story of the games, but more the, number one, gameplay, because the gameplay is just rock solid throughout most of the franchise, but more the world and lore around the games. I've always loved learning more about the Covenant and the Forerunners and the Halo and Flood and all that stuff. The lore of this series is much more interesting than necessarily the story of Master Chief, who, for the most part, is a fairly bland one-note character, at least up until Halo 4, where he's given at least a little bit more characterization in that game. And so with the kind of lukewarm buzz and the TV show kind of necessarily having to focus in on a story and a character who I don't particularly find to be all that interesting, I was kind of not really expecting to do much talking about this show. And I will say, having now watched the pilot episode, which I'm going to go full spoilers in just a minute on, I will say that I do think that my beat on it was fairly correct. That it was a kind of middling adaptation. Not bad, but not great either. Just mostly fairly bog standard. But having watched it, I do have to say that I am deeply intrigued by it because what this show is doing is trying to take a few different risks that, while I don't think necessarily pay off, I do find to be rather intriguing and kind of has me hooked in at least a little bit as a Halo fan to kind of see what they're going to do with it. And maybe it won't pay off, maybe the show will end up being still middling from front to back, but I'm at least hooked in enough to want to talk about it, which is saying something, to be honest. So with all that preamble out of the way, let's actually get into the discussion of this. So full spoilers going forward from here. I will say, as a fan of the games, one of the biggest things that I kind of had to overcome getting into this was a lot of my expectations, because I had heard that this show was sort of set in an entirely new universe from the games, but what I expected that to mean was that they were just going to retell the same story with a little bit of tweaks here, not needing to be beholden to the exact story of the games, but still wanting to tell the same basic thing. But what honestly surprised me most was how much this show kind of reframed a lot of the elements of the games. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not a completely radical shift in the lore of the games. We still have the Covenant, we still have the Spartans, we still have the UNSC military faction here, and we still also have the Rebels, who are playing a little bit more of a role up front in this show because necessarily we're beginning sort of before or right at the start of the Covenant War, whereas the first game in the Halo series kind of began in the middle of it, though we did get sort of some of that backfilled in games like Halo Reach and things like that. But a lot of that still is set standard here. But what I found to be most intriguing about the show was how it started to reframe a lot of these elements from the series. First and foremost, I actually want to talk a lot about the UNSC. In the video games, the UNSC military was sort of the organization that, well, not perfectly good by any means. I mean, they did contribute to the creation of the Spartan program, which was, stealing children, but it was never seemed like it was condoned. And in fact, later on in the series, we see that Halsey, the scientist who does do that, gets prosecuted for war crimes by the UNSC. So while they're not necessarily framed as perfectly, arbiters of moral goodness, they are framed as fairly good guys and the protagonists, sort of like military science fiction that we see in the game. Here, though, the show is actually framing them much more nebulously, and I found that to be kind of interesting. We have Halsey here, sort of playing that sort of nebulous role, but there's also a lot more aiding and abetting of kind of darker stuff within the UNSC. We have Commander Keyes, played, I think, really nicely here for the few short scenes that we get him, who is kind of enabling the murder of a rebel for military propaganda. I thought that was some of the most interesting choices that we have here. And then we also get to see a little bit of relationship between Captain Keyes and his daughter Miranda Keyes, who in the video game was a much more older, badass military commander. And I loved her in the games for that. But she was fairly just one note, sort of like badass military woman. And here she's much younger. And she seems to be much more conflicted within her place within the UNSC and still trying to figure out where she fits within this moral framework instead of being that confident commander. And so I found that element of this show to be so much more interesting because it just automatically is already sort of taking this more nebulous gray approach to looking at the UNSC that I really, really enjoyed. Some of the other things that I found to be a little bit more bog standard, though, in this series were elements like the Spartans fighting the Covenant. I mean, Spartans were kind of badass in the scene, but they weren't necessarily the, like, coolest things that I've ever really seen. I mean, obviously the show is putting a lot of money into Halo. Paramount's definitely shoving some of that Star Trek money at it, but it doesn't really ever come across as anything, like, super new and fresh, and honestly makes me wish they had put in even a little bit more money into it, because it does not completely come across as badass as I would like these Spartans to come across. And I think that just is an element of the games can just make things look so much cooler than we could ever do practically in a show. And because this isn't a movie where they can do sort of the crazy effects, it doesn't really sell me on all of that stuff. But that being said, what I do kind of enjoy is a little bit more of the humanization of Master Chief that we get in here. I mean, I was kind of thrown, again, off of my expectations with Pablo Schreiber playing Master Chief. Like, he doesn't have that Steve Downes voice, that, like, gravelly, like, heavy voice. He definitely comes off a little bit lighter than I expect the Master Chief to. But he does automatically give him a little bit more humanization within these first few episodes. The one thing I was kind of disappointed was by the end of the episode, he does take off his helmet to reveal Pablo Schreiber, and you get to see his full face. It was a nice moment when he did reveal his face. It wasn't used for willy-nilly. It was used to sort of gain the trust of the rebel girl who he wants to have help him. So I did at least enjoy that. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about The Mandalorian, the Star Wars show, while I don't love that show perfectly front to back, I did at least appreciate it that it had the confidence to really have Mando never actually ever take off his helmet for the most part. He does a little bit here and there, but it's all mostly sold on just the physical acting and voice acting of the character. And I think that I would have preferred to have stayed with that with Master Chief a little bit more here, because it would have allowed us to, if you had the confidence to read and sort of impress upon ourselves our own emotions onto him, and you can get a lot of that from the physical acting. And so I was a little bit disappointed in that, but that being said, the moments that did shine actually fairly worked. Like, you did get a read on Master Chief starting to recognize his humanity a little bit more. However, this does bring me to my biggest critique of the show right up front, is that I feel like a lot of people were saying in the reviews that the show felt really slow to them after the big open action sequence. And honestly, I have the complete opposite read on this. I feel like this show needed to slow down a hell of a lot more, because a lot of this episode is just immediately setting up, like, Master Chief starting to recognize his humanity, the UNSC sort of wrestling with the moral complexities of some of the choices that it has to make, the rebel girl sort of like pushing back against the UNSC, and it's just sort of like has these like status quo setups and then shifts right in the middle of this episode. It's like, here's what these things are. Here's the Spartans being badass, sort of emotionless warriors. Here's the UNSC being morally corrupt. Here's, the sort of setup of this world. And yet then immediately kind of goes against that and subverts it without really establishing those sort of, like, just what those things are. And actually the biggest comparison I can make to this show is actually The Expanse. The Expanse is one of my favorite science fiction series of all time. I adore that show. But one of the things that it really took time to do in its first few episodes of its show was establish what this world was. We got to learn about the Belters. We got to learn about Earth. We got to learn about Mars. And it took 3 or 4 episodes to establish each of those things and their status quos before we actually got to some of the bigger earth-shattering things that were going on within the lore of the series. Yes, we got hints of that towards the beginning of the show, but it definitely took its time to establish the status quo of this universe before breaking it apart. And while I've seen some friends who I've tried to get into The Expanse call the first few episodes of The Expanse really slow and hard to get into as a result, I think doing that laid a lot of necessary groundwork for us to understand when those things are being subverted. So when we come into the Halo show and it's automatically like, all right, Master Chief's gonna be on the run and he's gonna be subverted, and he's gonna be, being hunted by some of his old Spartan friends who we got to see at the beginning of the episode, and the UNSC is going to be taking him down, even though they're kind of surprised that they'd have to hunt down their biggest warrior. Like, that would have had more effect if we had spent an episode or 2 getting to know these sort of Spartans and getting to sit with them a little bit more. And I feel like the game, or the show, is trying to lean off of our knowledge of these characters from the game. At least me as a fan, I feel like it's trying to establish, like, yo, you know these characters in the game, so when they get subverted, we can be kind of shocked and like, oh my god, he's going against the UNSC. That's something that didn't actually happen in the video games. What a shocker. But I feel like because they are setting this in a new universe and also trying to bring in new people to this show, that it feels like I don't really get a bead on this version of the character. Because for all intents and purposes, while the pieces are familiar, this is a new sort of take on these characters, and so I need to get to know them, especially when you're changing so many interesting elements of it. That also being said too, one thing I haven't really talked about in this review is, and that's because we haven't really gotten to know them, is the Covenant. The Covenant in the Halo games, I think, is one of the most intriguing elements of the entire Halo lore. They are this sort of basically religious faction built up on religious dogma that is itself a critique on how religion is used to manipulate people and beliefs, and the way the prophets are utilized within that is, I think, a really interesting structure. The way the Covenant is built out lore-wise, and then also the character of the Arbiter, who I think is one of the more interesting characters in all of Halo canon, is honestly my favorite part of the story part of those games. Here, though, we don't really get a lot of that. We might get more of it here, but the one thing that I was disappointed is the wrong word, but less intrigued by, is the fact that we have seemingly a human woman as the main antagonist and leader, or at least a major driving force of the antagonism for the Covenant. We only get one scene with her, and we do get to see a conflict already within her, between her, being with the Covenant and also being a human, and we sort of get hints that she's going to be torn between two worlds. And I know that part of the reason to have her as the main villain is a sort of a practical, budgetary one, where it's easier to film a lady being the villain as opposed to like these Covenant creatures all the time. But that being said, I really liked the alienness of the Covenant, and I hope that doesn't get lost in just having a human protagonist, and it weakens the characters of the prophets because they're sort of being subservient to this human woman. We'll sort of see how that's built out, but I do really appreciate and love the prophets in the video game. I love their sort of critique on religion and how they're very weak creatures overall, but they are able to utilize the dogma of religion to gain power. I find it to be fascinating, and so to undercut that by having them have a human lady on top of them, in charge of them, or at least more of the driving antagonistic force, what I think would undo a lot of the power of that storyline. So, all that being said, this sort of leaves me very conflicted on this first episode, because I did not like necessarily this episode in and of itself. I didn't hate it. It's fine. And I see a lot of potential. Because I see them possibly being able to do things with this story that the original Halo wasn't able to do, like really critically analyze military infrastructure and actually give a voice to the insurgent rebels fighting the UNSC, and then sort of like highlighting the human conflict among the Covenant conflict, and sort of like using the Covenant as a sort of juxtaposition to the human conflict. I think is a really interesting take, and sort of placing Master Chief at the crux of that, I think, is also an interesting way to use him. I just think my disappointment more comes out of the fact that there's some choices that I like and didn't like, but also feeling like the show is actually moving a little bit too fast in getting through these story elements. But it all has me at least intrigued enough as a Halo fan to say, they're doing something different. And I can at least appreciate someone taking a risk than them just regurgitating to me the same exact thing that I've seen before. And it has me at least honestly hooked enough to keep watching and possibly doing more reviews. So let me know what your thoughts are of the Halo show. I'd love to know all your comments in the comments below. Were you intrigued by the Halo show? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my reviews on this channel and also my main channel, Jessie Gender After Dark, where I do my more video essay style stuff, my sort of bigger channel. Link is down below. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.